Broadcasting from the campus of Salisbury University, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. It's time for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
It was called Georgetown, not the one in Delaware, but an African-American community quite near downtown Salisbury. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. By one account, Georgetown was uptown, West Main Street was downtown, and there was even a Humphreys Lake. The community ultimately disappeared with the arrival of routes 13 and 50 that cut through the heart of the city. Linda Duyer has authored a book filled with pictures and maps of what once was this thriving African-American community. It's called Around the Pond, and she joins us in the studio this morning. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with where this is, right? Because I was not aware that there was such a community, or that there was a lake as well. How did you wind up, first of all, getting intrigued or finding out about this?
Well, I grew up in Salisbury from the age of 2, and still, I'm afraid to admit this, growing up, I really didn't absorb Salisbury's history. I didn't know much about Salisbury's history, let alone its African-American history. And I had moved away for college and work in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C., and then decided to come back and learn more. But I had heard that an old black church was being renovated for use as a cultural center, which became the Charles H. Chipman Cultural Center in Salisbury. And so I thought that was, I had barely remembered the church when I was growing up, boarded up. I might have seen it even just once or noticed it once. So I got curious about what they were renovating. I started attending their meetings and learned from a woman, Elaine Brown, who was sort of their unofficial historian and retired school teacher from the segregated Salisbury High School, that it was called Georgetown. And so whereas a church, there had to have been a community, and I wanted to document that community. I knew nothing about it. You got 2 highways going through it. There are very few landmarks left. That building is probably the only public landmark left, although there are a few other buildings. So I just started asking her. I said, Miss Brown, could you teach me or tell me more about the history of this neighborhood? And nowhere was it mentioned as being Georgetown, the name Georgetown. Just a few people have been telling me that. And so I decided, well, it's not documented anywhere. So I kept collecting information. She invited me to her home, and she strong-armed. She invited several of her older friends, many of whom had lived in that area, to come, and we had these discussion meetings where we talked about. They told me what it was like living where it was, and what it was like living in that community, and what it was like. So if you know where the Chipman Cultural Center is, that was pretty much the center of the whole area. At one point, there had been Humphreys Lake in Salisbury up until 1909,
right?
And it was drained when the dam broke, and they decided not to put it back because it gave them extra property, and so part of that property became part of Georgetown as well. But that little community is one of the oldest in Salisbury. It's associated with Poplar Hill Mansion, and so I decided to, research it to learn as much as I could about it.
So let me ask you this. Mm-hmm. So if we just start with the Charles Chipman Cultural Center, mm-hmm. as you look south, okay, towards downtown, mm-hmm. before 1909, before the lake was cleaned up, what did the town? What did that part look like, and what were we looking at in terms of Georgetown?
Well, if you were at the church and you were on its front steps and you were looking south, you would have seen Church Street go through. No Route 50. It's going through about where Route 50 is, and then beyond that, maybe another street or two, and then beyond that, the lake, which is about where the parking lot is and where Main Street is in that location. Main Street didn't go through that area. So actually, the John Wesley Church was referred to as the Church on the Hill. So it's up a little bit on the bluff, and then it slopes down towards the bottom land of the lake. And one thing you had mentioned was when I asked these people, I said, well, what were the black communities in Salisbury? And one friend of mine, Gladys Stewart, said we had uptown, downtown, and around the pond. I said, uptown. Uptown, she said, was Georgetown. Downtown was West Main Street area, the west side of Salisbury, sort of the black business district and their residential area. And I said, well, what's round the pond? What really is there is really two little neighborhoods right next to each other in Georgetown. It's always collectively referred to as Georgetown. There's no boundary between the two, but really the more bottomland along the lake area was really an area called Cuba or Cuby. And some people would think, well, that's a little unsavory area, but yet they were right next to each other. Cuba was, the Georgetown area was different, and yet they were so close and right next to each other. What surprised me was that there was a black community right in the downtown Salisbury. I had grown up, I'm a baby boomer. I grew up noticing Salisbury during my youth as being geographically segregated, with the west side being predominantly the African American area and the rest being predominantly white. You can see that today as the vestige of our election districts with one and two. So it was a surprise to me that there had been a neighborhood right downtown, wedged in between Newtown and the downtown business district and the railroad tracks, and before the highways went through. So it was a major surprise to me. And so often I majored in geography and also with an interest in African American history. And I had always thought of historically communities with their black section, the African American section, as being nearby but somehow divided by a railroad track or a river or something. And that was true. I know a teacher here, she referred to them as satellite communities, But in fact, Georgetown was right downtown. Whites and blacks lived across the street from each other.
So, what was the origin of this community as we sort of reach back? Is the Poplar Mansion?
I think it was Poplar Hill Mansion, because much of part of that area, most of the area, was on property that had once belonged to Poplar Hill Mansion. In fact, the John Wesley Church was founded by 5 freedmen. Most or all of them had been enslaved. They were freed at the time in 1830s, 37 and 38. And some of the housing might have been either freedmen's housing or slave housing. So that connection was close to Poplar Hill Mansion. And, of course, it grew a little bit. Of course, the neighborhood was small, but so was Salisbury. So.
Right. So as we expand out from there, so is this the community that sort of then develops out of this plantation, for lack of a better word, this mansion area? I mean, is that how that works? Because I know there were. I think you mentioned that in your book that there were some folks who look as if they had been, say, freed slaves who then became involved with the John Wesley Church. Correct.
Yes, they had, and I imagine they're more so worked that way. Where it became, some may have been freedmen all along. I don't really know. I just knew that the 5 founders of the John Wesley Church, some of them had been enslaved at one point or another. One bought their freedom and bought the freedom of his wife, and their children went on to be kind of prominent in the community, that sort of thing. In fact, I was just rereading my book earlier, and there was a quote that one of the members of the community, Solomon Houston, His father, we believe, had been Levin Houston, who had been enslaved and was freed, and then was one of the members of the founders of the John Wesley Church. Solomon Houston was quoted as having been the richest African American in this part of the state. And so there were a lot of surprises in my research, and he was related, so you can see on the old 1877 atlas the pond, the lake, Humphreys Lake, and you can see some indication of African Americans living along it, not far from Poplar Hill Mansion. And Poplar Hill Avenue was the access drive for Poplar Hill.
So what was this community like at the time? Was it developed into the turn of the 20th century? What kinds of businesses, what kind of people were involved? Can you get a sense at all about that?
Yes, I did, and I know that I had mentioned to you that Richard Cooper had written a book on. He's written several books. He's was a surveyor and is Salisbury historian, and had written a lot of books. And he's the only one that actually, up until me, had mentioned Georgetown or this area, Cuba and Georgetown, at all. And it was with a negative connotation as being a slum. And so I kind of challenged him a bit. Mm-hmm. But he was very gracious and offered a lot of information to me, which actually countered a lot of what he said. Yes, there were rental properties, but it wasn't a slum, or at least the whole thing was not a slum. And I often ask audiences, what do you call a place that had not one, not two, but three churches? It expanded to three churches, an elementary school that was 2 stories, a high school, a small high school, a Masonic hall, a grocery store, a bicycle shop, a barber shop, Masonic hall, I think I said, and at least 2 dry goods stores, a funeral business. They had laborers, but they had porters, seamstresses, people that own their own businesses, building houses, bricklayers, haulers, anything that was needed in Salisbury. There were many African Americans that owned their own businesses, but they were in a location where they could work either downtown as porters or cooks or whatever, or they could work in the service of the residents of like the Newtown area. And so this was an area that had, two cemeteries, 2 schools. So this was a place where people were born, they were raised, they worshiped, they were educated in 2 schools. They married, they worked, they served their community in fraternal organizations. They lived, they died, and were buried in Salisbury, right in that neighborhood. So I always say to people, well, what kind of term do you use to describe a small neighborhood or a community like that? And I say neighborhood. It's, it was more than, and I never wanted to write a book initially. I was just researching, but there were 2 reasons that made me do a book. One was that the people that I interviewed kept imploring me to make sure that the history of Georgetown wasn't forgotten. And it took me a long time to publish the book, and many of them had passed by that time. But also in the meantime, Mr. Cooper had written his book and was saying these brief things about Georgetown, and I knew that I didn't want that to be the definitive history of Georgetown. I know it needed to be in the libraries and available for people who are researching and to be proud of their neighborhood. There is no sign. There is no historical marker for Georgetown. There is one for the building of the John Wesley Church that is now the Chipman Cultural Center, but there's no sign that explains there's a whole neighborhood around here, and there are remnants to it. So sorry if I went on too much. But.
No, that's fine. So tell me then also a little bit about this lake, or I guess as I was looking at the book, there's like Humphreys Pond and there's Humphreys Lake, and describe for me how these rivers and intersected. Why is it they decided that once the dam broke, they just didn't?
There's two prongs to the Wicomico River, and most of Salisbury, the old Salisbury, is right downtown is between the two, and they form the Wicomico River. They both have lakes on them. The north prong still does, but the east prong had Humphreys Lake, and when it drained, when the big storm and the dam burst, some entrepreneurs, and I can't pronounce that very well, decided there was some property to be had, and then they decided not to put the lake back in, and they created a realty company for all those properties. That includes the area around the park now. If you go through the park and you see some low areas in the park, not far from the zoo, there was a lake there, and that's why it's low. If you drive around the park,
that's where the lake was.
That's where the lake was.
Okay.
It's harder to imagine that downtown because Main Street ended at Division, and there was a big house there too, right next to the courthouse. But beyond that house was the lake, so they extended Main Street, and they graded a lot over the years. But you can tell when you're at Division and Main Street, and you drive down towards Route 13, you're going downhill a little bit.
Now, there's a number of prominent people that come out of this, but one of the ones that jumped out at me was Sergeant William Butler.
Yes.
This was a hero of Water Street, is how you call it. Tell me then a little bit about him, because this was during the First World War.
Yes.
And it's, I guess, much of what we know is from the Scott's official history of the African American Negro in the World War. Tell me a little bit about him, and what do we know about him, and how did he?
Well, what I knew was from the book you referenced. I forget how I came up with the name in the first place, but I did find that book, and that you talked about. But also Stephen Ginrich from Salisbury University has a big interest in the history of World War I, and in particular African American involvement. So I had been in touch with him before and after the printing of the book, and he explained the book, as well as the book, the 369th, I think it was, his heroism in World War I. He did return to Salisbury briefly, and he was honored in the John Wesley Church. Gave a big program honoring him, gave him a gold watch, according to newspaper articles. And he had married a woman and was living on Water Street, right where the parking lots are now. But for some reason he left the area and divorced. And Stephen found out that he ended up in Washington, D.C., had a business, and for many years. And but he died, I think, in the 1950s, and is buried in Arlington Cemetery. He committed suicide. Not clear why. He was ill, but he also had lost his business. But you also wonder what effect World War I had on him, because it was a very negative. People often talk about African American veterans coming back after World War II and the abuses they felt they experienced, but was even worse for World War I veterans. But he was so decorated in New York City, and along with the group got a ticker tape parade. So I was rather surprised to find him having been from Salisbury.
Because you mentioned, I guess, that he was actually fired on some Germans and was able to actually get some Americans who had been captured released.
Exactly. Yes, he did fire. His group was being fired upon. I think several died or something, and he was being fired on. But I don't know how he managed to do it, but he did end up firing on the Germans and actually capturing some and bringing them back. So few people know that we had a hero here.
Yeah. So tell me then, by the way, a little bit about Charles Chipman, because he really plays a sort of this prominent role. Some people later on in his life were very critical of him, and what kind of role did he play in this community?
Well, he was not from Salisbury. He was from New Jersey. He almost went when he got his degrees. He almost went to Tuskegee to teach, but he got an offer here to not only teach but be a principal of the black high school. And he married someone who was from this area, Jeanette Pinkett. She too was related to one of the five that founded the John Wesley Church. But you have to realize that in the 1940s, Route 13 went through the community. It took the AME church, and it might have taken the elementary school. Then Route 50 went through and took the Baptist church and so many other businesses. How the John Wesley building survived might be part geography and part due to the will of the Chipmans, because there was no community left. All the members were joining a church on the White Chapel on the west side, so it ceased being a church, and he bought the building to save it with his goal in mind of one day being a cultural center, in which it did. And so that was his role in saving that building. I don't know what you mean in terms of other roles.
I mean,
I don't know how.
I guess he was prominent in the community.
He was very prominent in the community. I don't know how he was. Yeah. How there was controversy. I may have heard some along the way.
Sure.
But anytime when there's a transfer of a building, there's sometimes controversy.
Sure.
But you have to actually, it was probably his wife's role. Mostly, she was probably the one that pushed the hardest. I was told this. To make sure that this was a cultural center. So they were a team, and she was from here, so that's pretty good.
So now, also, before we leave this, I guess there are two cemeteries. One's Houston and the other one is Pottersfield. Tell me about those.
Well, they're on the other side of the railroad tracks,
right.
And there's one cemetery that's long been known as Salisbury Cemetery. It was sort of cut through by the Route 50, and it's right. You can see it on the side of the highway, behind it, next to the Arby's, and you come up from under the railroad tracks, and that's a very old cemetery that had been segregated with a colored section, and you can see that on the 1877 atlas. And I think Levin Houston is buried there, and not many markers. But there's a cemetery right behind it. The property was purchased, I think, 1901, so it's nowhere near as old as the old Salisbury City Cemetery. And that was purchased by Solomon Houston and U.G. Langston and a number of families as a multi-family cemetery for African Americans that they could control, and it was named the Houston Cemetery. And some people confuse. They think they're both the same cemetery, but they're not.
So, but by the way, tell me, the person you were talking about, Elaine Brown, tell me a little bit about her, because she seemed to be instrumental in really for doing the
She was very involved in the Chipman Foundation and the restoration plans for the building. That had belonged to that church until it moved to the west side, and she continued with Wesley Temple. She always had an interest in the history. She was a retired school teacher, English. She taught drama and everything. And she had family, that had lived in the Georgetown area and that sort of thing. She was really nice. When I asked, I wanted to learn more about this. She was very open. I was virtually a stranger, so that was very kind of her to bring me into her home and invite all her friends to talk openly to me. Obviously I could not speak to everyone I could possibly speak to, but thanks to her, I met so many people. She died shortly before the grand opening of the Chipman Cultural Center, but she was thrilled. She knew we had made the money.
Well, because I think, as a matter of fact, I think it was an account where she talks about, I guess it was a state superintendent coming in, and just the quote says this: "So he looked at me and said, right in front of the children after he'd been there for a while and listening to what I was saying, he said, 'You don't look like you're scared of me at all.' I just looked at him and smiled and kept right on until after I was finished and dismissed my class."
Yes, I had forgotten that was in there. But
sounds like a very strong.
She was a strong-willed person that didn't always come across well, but she was determined to have her way and the right thing. Yeah, she was a pretty strong-willed person. I have to admit that, and she was talkative. When we had these meetings, group discussion meetings in her home, she wanted to talk so bad, and yet she stayed out of the room on purpose so that I could learn from all these people. She was strong-willed, but she was very generous, very generous.
So the one incident occurs in 1931. There was a hanging, a lynching in Salisbury, and you had not actually asked anybody about this during your discussions, except for one particular.
Except for one man. And
tell me about that, because it seemed, because as we were talking before we were on the air, that this moment seemed so really dramatic to you in terms of who he was, and
I believe it was pivotal to the demise of Georgetown. Many may not agree with me, but I believe so. When I grew up, I had heard about the lynching of Matthew Williams, but I never heard of Georgetown. So I just assumed African Americans who may have been trying to run home to the safety of their homes were all going home to the West Side. That wasn't, so. But once I was at these meetings and learning all about Georgetown, and I knew that this man Howard Purnell had been a young adult at the time of the lynching, I could not resist asking him. I did not bring up the topic in our meetings because I just had come to know these people. I figured it wasn't my place. If they wanted to bring it up to any of the negative stuff, I'd be happy to talk about it and listen. But I didn't bring it up. But at the end of one of our meetings, when everybody was gone, he and another man, James Jolly, got up, headed for the door, and I'm sitting there, and I said, Mr. Purnell, where were you on December 4th, 1931? And he stopped in his tracks, and he looked at me, and he said, "What do you mean, the lynching?" And I said, "Yes, I think I said that." And he said, and he looked at me, and I think he must have been shocked by the question, maybe the timing of the question, and he said, "Yes." He says, "I was there, and what really sticks in my craw, that was my mother's birthday." So he sat down and he began to tell me about having witnessed the lynching, a lynching of a fellow classmate. He had been in, he worked at the Wycomico Hotel, which was right across the street from the lynching at the courthouse. That he usually works nights, but he switched his hours to go to a movie right on Main Street. And while he was in the movie theater, word was circulating what was happening outside, and everyone was leaving. And I just was imagining everyone going to the west, running to go home to the West Side. But no, he lived in Georgetown. His way to go home would be to walk past the courthouse, down Main Street, past the courthouse, past Wycomico Hotel, down Main Street, all the way to where the railroad tracks were, turn left, and go into this. He was living with his parents at the time. He would have had to go right into the mob. As it was, he had to go towards the mob to Division Street. Instead, he made a quick left. He heard his classmate being strung up several times, and he rushed down Church Street to get home. When he got to his parents' home, his father was upstairs at the window with a shotgun to watch what's going on, because you never knew during a lynching what might happen to the other people, and he could witness the body being burned because the body was dragged from the courthouse down Main Street to right in front of the Georgetown Cuba neighborhood. for that purpose of showing them the burning of the body. And he was burned right where the parking lot is now, where the flea market happens every day, every weekend. And so it was definitely a terrorizing situation for that community of Georgetown. It was terrorizing for everybody. And it was terrorizing afterwards because Georgetown was so interlocked with downtown. Whites and blacks crossed each other in the street to go to church, go to business every day. And those people had to go into the homes in Newtown to work for those white families and look each other in the eye. So it was a very tense time after that, particularly for Georgetown. And I wouldn't be surprised if that happened in 31. So in 1940s, Route 13 cut through and took part of it. And then Route 50 went through.
Now, and one of the things about talking about Purnell is that the words sort of seemed to
came
pour
out of him.
him.
It poured out of him like he couldn't control it. It's as if I'd bumped into him, and then the words started to fall out, and he couldn't stop it. He sat down on the sofa next to me, Mr. Jolly in the chair opposite, and words just poured out of what had happened. And at one time, we all just stopped with our mouths agape. I couldn't believe what he had just said, and he couldn't believe what he had just said, because I don't think he was used to talking about it, certainly not to someone white and virtually a stranger. And suddenly he heard something. I had a tape recorder between us that I had been running for our meeting earlier, and I just forgot about it, and it was still running. And he heard the whir of the other tape recorder, and the frightened look on his face I'll never forget, because it was such a raw, frightened look, as if the lynching had occurred the day before. So that impact of what that happened has impacted him all these years. After I did that interview, I didn't ask many more questions. I was so grateful that he bothered to talk to me about it. Later on, Sherilyn Eiffel did a book on the courthouse lawn on all this lynching and other lynchings, and she had interviewed him, and he refused to talk. He wouldn't talk about it. In fact, she said he took it to his grave. I wrote her, I said, that's not true. He told me. But that just shows you the power of what a lynching can do all those years later.
So what do you make of the fact that we, for the most part in Salisbury, really don't know anything about this community? It's almost disappeared from our memories. Obviously there were people who've been here a long time, but also we have lots of people who are coming in who've never been here before and washing away some of that history that you...
Some people growing up didn't know. African Americans growing up, I had learned, did not know about the history. It's hard to make something of that. I don't know if there was such bad feelings of having really your neighborhood taken away from you. And the moving to the west side, there might have been some bitterness, and that always brings a feeling of families just not wanting to talk about things. Now, I don't know if that's part of it. I don't know why. Certainly not in any history books. Oddly, the lynching is.
Right, of course that is.
That's in the history books, but not the neighborhood itself. And it kind of perplexes me, too. There really should be a memorial to it, as well as books.
We've been speaking with Linda Duyer. She has authored a book called Round the Pond. It's a book that's filled with pictures and maps of the once thriving African-American community, Georgetown, which is not Georgetown as in Delaware, but Georgetown here actually in Salisbury. And that's something that, a rich history. And I appreciate you taking time to stop by and talk with us.
Thank you very much.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush, and thanks for listening.
This has been Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Chris Rank produces and is our audio engineer. Don Rush is your host. For podcasts, visit our website, delmarvapublicradio.net, or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast in iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14. To view the schedule, visit the Daily Times or visit pac14.org.